Hello, welcome. Give me a wave if everybody can hear me. I know you are all on mute at the moment. Excuse me. Maybe I need to be on mute. We're going to wait. There are others who are coming, but we'll go ahead and get started so that we can kind of not keep you guys forever because you probably want to get to dinner, even though this is going to be a really interesting evening. Uh, all of you are muted right now, and I'm going to ask Dr. Truitt to unmute, and I'm going to, I need to invite you to do that, I think. There you are. You're unmuted now. That's great. So just say hello to be sure we can hear your
Hi,
voice.
can everyone hear me?
Yeah, there you are.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's great. But before I formally introduce Dr. Truitt, I always like to talk about things that are happening at the bookstore and a few other housekeeping items. First of all, my name is Georgia Court. I'm the proprietor of Bookstore One in Sarasota. And I have to say that even though, because of COVID, we can't be doing any in person events, I have loved these Zoom events because it brings us people who maybe couldn't ordinarily be at the bookstore. I don't know, Dr. Truitt, are you in Arizona right now?
I am right now. I share my time between Sarasota and Arizona.
You do. So we could have seen you in the bookstore. In fact, I think you were scheduled earlier in the year and then COVID boom hit right around that time. So I'm so glad that you can join us today. But just a couple of pieces of information before we get going. Um, Dr. Truitt's book is entitled Tree Story, and that's what she's going to be talking about today. And I'll, as I say, I'll do the formal introduction in a second. But if you go to the chat, you're going to find a link to purchase that book. And if you go to the chat, you're going to find another link. And I'll tell you what that is. I always like to talk about the kind of the next upcoming event that I think the audience would be interested in. That event is October 20th, and it's celebrating Elana Ferrante. Elana Ferrante is the author who nobody knows who she is, but she wrote the whole series, the Neapolitan novels that follow the two young women from childhood to adulthood, the first one being My Brilliant Friend. We are going to have Bookstore's own Elsie Souza live in conversation with Ferrante's translator, Ann Goldstein, and her US publisher, Michael Reynolds, who is the editor in chief of Europa Editions. That's going to be on October 20th. And if you're interested in seeing that, there is a link in the chat that would take you to where you can find out more about that and that you can RSVP. Also, this evening, we're going to have kind of a small audience, it appears. So for the Q&A, I think rather than my gathering questions in chat and writing them down and giving them to Dr. Truitt, once her talk is finished, I would really like to go ahead and open up so that unmute everybody so that we can just talk among ourselves. You can ask questions directly. And at the moment, I know that one thing I need to do is to allow Dr. Truitt to be uh, there. I've given her the ability now to use screen share because I do believe she plans to do that. Okay. All right. Let me introduce Dr. Valerie Trouet. She's professor at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona. Her main research interest is the tree ring based reconstruction of climate dynamical patterns and their influence on terrestrial ecosystems and ecosystem disturbances. She is assistant professor of dendrochronology, laboratory of tree ring research, and assistant professor of watershed management, School of Natural Resources and the Environment at the University of Arizona. To bring it to us lay people, we all know that to tell how old a tree is, you count its rings. But few of us know that research into tree rings is a significant area of study. And this afternoon, Dr. Truitt will talk about her book, Tree Story, a book that reveals how the seemingly simple concept of counting tree rings has inspired far-reaching scientific breakthroughs that illuminate complex interactions between nature and people. Dr. Truitt, it is all yours, and I will disappear and come back later when it's time for Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Georgia. It's really a pleasure and an honor. And I'm currently in Tucson, Arizona. I'm teaching online here this semester, but I don't teach in a spring semester, and that's when I spend my time in Sarasota. And I heard that, you know, I was in Sarasota up until September when it was still hot, and I heard that it's cooling down a bit now, and that it's a good time to go to the beach. So I hope to be in Sarasota soon. What a wild ride this has been, this book. So I'm a professor at the University of Arizona. I was actually approached by a publisher from Johns Hopkins University Press if I wanted to write a book, a broad audience book about my field of research, dendrochronology. This was now 3 years ago. And obviously when I started writing this, I didn't know that by April 2020, when the book came out, that there was going to be a global pandemic. And so that book events such as this was originally planned to happen in May. We're all going to be online, but actually I can't complain. I'm really, it's been really a very positive experience, both to write this book and then to get feedback from people and just to see how it evolves. It's not something that many professors have the honor of being involved in. I'm really giddy today. I just want to share this with you. I haven't had a chance to share it with many people yet, but so my book also got translated in Dutch. So if you hear an accent, my mother tongue is Dutch. I'm from Belgium originally. So the book was translated in Dutch, and I just heard like at 1 a.m. Tonight that it won the prize for the best nature book in the Dutch speaking country. So it's I'm really, yeah, as I mentioned, it's been a wild ride to just experience all of this. But so I'm really happy to share with you. I'm going to start sharing some slides here in a second, what it's all about, this book, right? And what it is that I do as a dendrochronologist. And so I have prepared some slides. I'll talk for probably 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. If you have any questions in the meanwhile, I'll try and keep an eye on the chat, but it's not that straightforward when I'm sharing my screen. But there should be plenty of time for questions afterwards. All right, let's see how this works. Can you all see my screen? Okay, so this is, the title of the book is Tree Story, the History of the World Written in Rings. And that's really what it is about. I am a dendrochronologist. So dendrochronology comes from the words dendros, which is trees, and chronos, which is Greek for time. So what we do as dendrochronologists is study time or the past using tree rings, the rings in trees. And so it's much more than, I think most people are familiar with the concept of counting rings, as in if you count the rings in a tree and every ring represents 1 year, then you can get an idea of how old the tree is. But what's really important is that it's not just the fact that the tree forms a ring and one ring every year, but that, and you can see that here, that not all rings are equal. Some are wider than others. And so the width and the characteristics of each ring can tell us a lot about history, and not just the history of the trees, but also the history of climate and human history, because we can work with anything that's made out of wood. So not just living trees, but also wooden buildings, art historical material, musical instruments and the like. So it's really, what I really like about my field of research is this link between the ecological side of things, the climate side of things, and then the human side of things. It really incorporates all three nicely. So in my book, I collaborated with Oliver Uberti, who's a really fantastic data visualizer, and he made these beautiful end papers. This one shows, as you can see, a map of all the places in the world that I talk about in the book. And then the surroundings, you can see that I don't just talk about trees, there's a lot of trees in it, obviously, but also about historical events and climate events. I'll start with explaining how dendrochronology works. So one, I think, really important thing for everyone to know is that we don't need to cut down trees in order to do our research. I think our field of research would have not reached as far as it has if we had to cut down every tree that we wanted to sample. So we have a hollow core. This is what you see here, that we can core into the tree. It's about 1/4 of an inch in diameter. We do this by hand, so it can be quite a tough job. Like oaks, for instance, are very hard wood, and so getting that core into the stem of a tree can be quite labor intensive. And then what we extract out of it is kind of a pencil-sized sample of wood that we extract out of the tree. It doesn't hurt the tree. It's a bit like drawing blood from a person. It punctures the tree stem, but that's about it. And then these pencils, we take them back to the lab. You can kind of see the rings on it a little bit here. But what we do in the lab, the first thing we do is we sand them really finely with grit up to 400, 800, sometimes even over 1,000. And that's when the rings really come out. So these are those cores that have been mounted and then sanded. And so you can really see the rings very nicely. And you can see the variation in the width of the rings that I was talking about earlier. This is one of my favorite examples. It really shows the process of what we do. It's matching the patterns that we see in rings from different trees. So these are now not cores, these are samples from 3 oak beams from 3 completely different buildings in Ireland. But they were the oaks that these beams were made out of grew at the same time. And so you can see what I mean by pattern matching by looking at this pattern of these 3 really, in this case, wide rings that occur in these 3 beams that were growing in different areas that were cut at different different times. But because the trees grew at the same time, they show very similar patterns. And it's those patterns that we look for in dendrochronology. What we do then, this is my former graduate student, Zakia Kamisi. She's working on a sample from Tanzania in this case, is we put those samples on a measurement stage that's connected to a computer with measurement software, and that automatically measures the width of each ring and then gives you the data to work with and then to do the statistical analysis on. I'm not going to go on to the statistical side of things. There's quite a bit of statistics involved in this, but that definitely is beyond the scope of this talk. And also I don't really talk too much about that in the book. Maybe in a follow-up book, there might be more interest in statistics there. At this point, I want to, before I talk about some applications, I want to go to another screen. Let's see. This is a platform that a colleague of mine at the University of Minnesota developed just really recently, and it's not published yet. It's not publicly available yet, but he's allowed me to use this platform to show to show you today what, what really gets me as a scientist excited and started me into this field. I often get the question, well, where does this come from? How does one become a dendrochronologist? And so my background is in forestry, and that's where it originally came from. But when I really got hooked on dendrochronology is when I started looking at those samples under the microscope in the lab. And this is why I want to show you what we actually see when we go into the lab. So this is a core, as I've shown you earlier. This is the pith of the tree, so the center of the tree, and then this here, this here is the bark of the tree. So we've cored in from this side towards the center of a tree. So you can see all the individual rings. The most recent ring is right here under the bark, and the oldest ring is in the center. So what I'm going to do now is zoom in. So my colleague Dan Griffin has, the resolution is not as good. Oh, that's such a shame. Oh, let's try again. All right. Sorry, I was hoping this was going to work better. Let's try again. It's a different sample. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me here for a second. Yeah, that's better, the resolution. So now I'm zooming in. You can see the individual rings. So he scanned these samples at super high resolution. And so I'm going to keep zooming in. You can see the rings, and now you can start seeing the individual cells that the rings are being made up of. So this is of a pine tree, a ponderosa pine from the American Southwest, I think from northern Arizona. And this is really what ring widths are made up of. This is, so the entire ring, sorry, play around a little bit. So this is one ring. This is what we call the early wood. It's formed in spring. This is the wood that the tree forms in spring when it has a lot of energy. And you can see that the cells are rather big compared to the late wood, right? This is the wood that the tree forms towards the fall as it's shutting down. So in spring, the tree forms big cells so it can transport a lot of water. And then as towards fall, sorry, it's moving around. So spring, summer, and then towards fall, the tree starts shutting down for the winter. It starts losing its leaves, and the cells that it forms are quite different. They're smaller and they have a bigger, a thicker cell wall. And then in winter, when the days get short and it gets too cold, the trees stop growing altogether. And then the next spring, they start growing big cells with thin cell walls again. And it's this transition between the late wood cells, the small late wood cells of 1 year, and then the big early wood cells of the next year. That's the rings that you see. It's the difference between the wood of 1 year and the wood of the next year. That's, if you zoom out, I'll zoom out again. Keep an eye on this ring. Those are the rings that you see when you count rings. That's why tree rings are annual, because the trees stop growing in winter every year. The other example I have, close this one, is of an oak. I'm going to do the same thing. You'll see that the anatomy of the wood here is very different. So an oak is this might be bad resolution again. All right. Here for a second. An oak is it's not a needle leaf tree, it's a broadleaf tree, right? So they came later in evolution than the conifers and the needle leaf trees. And that makes that the anatomy of their wood is very different and much more complex. So I'm doing the same thing here. I'm zooming in And now you see a tree ring of an oak, an individual tree ring of an oak. And you can see that they have very different structures. So this is one ring, and they have different cell types and all of that. I'm not going to go into detail there, but you can see the similar idea that this is the early wood, the wood that the oak forms in spring. And this is the wood that it forms in the fall, and they look very differently. And then the transition from the wood that it forms in the fall of one year towards the spring of the next year, that's the boundary, that's the tree rings that you see. If I zoom out again. So I just wanted to show you this because this gets me so excited. This is really what I find wood so beautiful if you look at it through a microscope. These patterns, they're really beautiful, but it's also very functional. Every cell in wood has its function and has its role. And I think that's really fascinating. All right, I'll go back to my presentation here. I'll talk about some applications here that I also mentioned in the book, because I want to kind of show the breadth of the topics that I cover, the stories that I cover in the book. So the first main application and what my research group is focused on is using the rings in trees to look at the climate of the past. I'll give an example here where we use tree rings from blue oaks that grow in the Central Valley in California. And here you see an example, gorgeous trees. We use trees from about 30 sites in the Central Valley to reconstruct how much snow there is in the Sierra Nevada every year. So these blue oaks, they're some of the most rainfall sensitive trees that I know, meaning that every dry year in California is captured by a narrow ring in the blue oaks, and vice versa. The wet years are captured by wide rings in the blue oaks, and they're super reliable, these blue oaks. They really don't like it when it's dry, and they really do like it when it's wet. So their ring widths really give a very good representation of how wet or how dry California is. Some of these trees are up to 500 years old, so we were able to use these trees to reconstruct the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada every year. This is don't worry about what this means, but it's basically a metric of how much snow there is in the Sierra Nevada in every year from the year 1500 to the year 2015. So 1500 is on the left, the present or most recent time is on the right, and every dot represents a year. And so what we found is I don't know if people are familiar with California, but California went to a very severe drought from 2012 to 2016. And in 2015, it became clear just how dry this year was. And the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada in 2015, we knew that it was the lowest it had been over the 80 years that they've been measuring with instruments, the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. And so what we now found by using tree rings to reconstruct that snowpack is that 2015 wasn't just the lowest in the last 80 years, it was the lowest over the past 500 years. So that really put the California drought into a longer term perspective. And that's the aim of what we're doing with our dendroclimate research, as it's called. Another important application, in addition to climate history, is forest history or ecological history. This is again an example from California, where we can study the history of fires, the history of wildfire in California. And I can talk for half an hour just about this topic, but what we found is that in the past, prior to the 20th century, California fires, again in the Sierra Nevada fires, their fire regime was a regime of ground fire. So fires like this that stayed close to the ground and that might burn off the undergrowth, the brush and grasses and the young trees, but typically it wouldn't kill the big mature trees. However, it can hurt, it can damage those big mature trees, it can leave wounds in these trees. And I don't know if any of you visit California occasionally this year in Nevada, or have visited this year in Nevada, but you can find many trees there that look like this. So these are living trees, or in this case, stumps, that have been burned by these kind of ground fires very frequently. And when a ground fire burns a tree, it can leave a wound, and trees can't heal wounds. They can't heal, they can't make them disappear, but what they do is they try and grow over the wound. And so they form a layer of growth, but then when another fire hits 5 or 10 or 15 years later, there's another wound and they form another layer of growth. So all of these layers, I'll show you this example. All of these layers that you see here are witnesses of past fires that this tree has survived. And so when you take a sample through a tree like this, in this case, you can't do it with a core, you have to do it with a chainsaw. This is what it looks like. So you cut the tree with a chainsaw. These are all the fire scars that have been left by past fires. And through tree ring dating, through dendrochronology, we can date when these fires happen. So that is an example from the Sierra Nevada. This tree had a first fire in 1765, last fire in 1889, about 20 fires in between. Some of these scars are so precise that by looking at the position of the scar within a ring, you can tell whether the fire happened in the spring, in the summer, or in the fall. That's what these letters indicate. But so this way we can estimate how frequently fires happened in the past, how widespread they were, and so forth. Or even the fact that there was a fire regime of ground fires in the past in California. We found that out through tree. So you can see, for instance, here, the last fire in this tree, and this is a live tree, last fire was in 1889. And this we see all over the Sierra Nevada, that it's very hard to find any fire scars in the 20th century, because we've been putting out fires and we've been very effective at that. So fire history is the second example. Third example, and this I find, I mean, this makes me want to be an archaeologist rather than a dendroclimatologist. So the third application really is human history. Because we're not limited to working with living trees alone, we can work with really anything that's made out of wood, as long as it has enough rings. And so there's some beautiful examples. This is an example of the Sweet Track, which is a wooden walkway that was built in the Somerset Levels, so in the UK, in Neolithic times. So they built these wooden walkways to cross marshes and peatlands. And because since then, the wood has sunk into these peatlands, and it's been preserved underwater. And so because it's underwater or in peat, oxygen can't reach it, and the wood doesn't decay. It stays preserved as long as it's underwater. So through dendrochronology, we have been able to date the pieces of, this is all oak, that these Neolithic peoples used. And they dated back to 3807 BCE, so before Common Era, before the year 0. So these are almost 6,000 years old. They've been preserved in the peat for almost 6,000 years. And what I find so striking here is we know very little about people 6,000 years ago. We know next to nothing. We don't know what language they spoke, if they spoke language at all, what they ate. There's so many things we don't know, but we do know to the year, and actually to the season, when this walkway was built. thanks to dendrochronology. And so because there have done a bunch of artifacts, pottery and so forth have been found right around us sweet tract, we've been also able to date some of their tools there. Another application in terms of human history is art history. So this is work from my colleague Marta Dominguez del Mas, who's at the University of Amsterdam, and she works at the Rijksmuseum there in Amsterdam. And so when we want to look at art historical pieces such as this medieval statue here, or musical instruments, for instance, obviously we can't go in with our increment core. But this is quite this is a paper published this year, so this is quite a novel technique where now they've developed this big CT scanner where they can scan the whole statuette, and this is then scanned from at this part, and you can actually see the tree rings on that scan, and then you can apply the same techniques that we use of matching the patterns in the trees that in the rings that you see here to existing patterns. That way you can find out when. You can't find out exactly when the statue was built, but you can find out when the tree grew, and so you can give a rough idea of the century that this statue was built. This is also, the other thing you can find out is where the wood came from, and it's called dendroprovenancing. So it's very important for the history of wood use and past wood trade within Europe, also within the US, by the way. By matching the pattern that you see on this sample with patterns from trees, let's say all over Europe, you can see where in Europe you find the best match, and so where that wood most likely came from. I'll switch gears here. I just wanted to show you some photos of field work, of what we do in the field, because it's one of my favorite aspects of being a dendrochronologist. It's what drew me into this line of work in the first place. So Smolikas is a site where we went to a few years ago in northern Greece, so in mainland Greece. It's a very mountainous area. And this is our research team. My colleague, Paul Krusic, who's at the University of Oxford, and his son, who was 12 then, Jonas. And then my other colleague, Jan Esper, who's in Germany, and his postdoc, Claudia. And just to show you that I was actually there as well, that's me in the photo as well. So we went to Smolikas because Paul had seen a photo of this site with what looked like very old trees. So he was convinced that there were some very old trees for us to core there. And typically in field work, what we do is, so in this case, we stayed in the town of Samarina, which was about a 2 hours hike down from this site. Obviously high in the mountains, there's no towns there. That's also why there's still old trees there. So typically we stay in a village, and then we start our day by hiking up to to the top of the mountain where the trees are. And then you get rewarded with these kind of views. I mean, Greece is really one of my favorite places that I've ever done field work in. These are some more views of these, we're talking, about 6,000 feet elevation. Pretty rugged landscape. It was cold. This was in July, and you see we're all bundled up, so it was cold. Very dry area as well, and you can see these really gnarly, old-looking trees. So we hiked up. Here's my colleague Claudia started coring one of those trees. We were there for about a week. We typically go for about a week, depending on how remote the area is. And Paul was right. So we actually found Adonis, the oldest known living tree in Europe, right there at the Smolikas site. So this tree was 1,075 years old when we cored it. So that was 5 years ago, must be 1,080 years old now. I mean, that's really, you know, the feeling of extracting that core out of a living tree. And already in the field, you can see, you know, you can see that there's a lot of rings in it, and that they're very narrow. And it's exciting to then think that you might have your hands on a very old tree. Now, the other thing with that Smolicus side, this is the time series of the Adonis. The other thing with a Smolicus side is this is what it looked like. And so you can see all of these old living trees that I talked about, a gorgeous view. But you can also see that there's a lot of dead wood still lying around on the landscape. So as I mentioned, we're not limited to just looking at the living trees. We can also sample the dead trees. And some of these dead trees that have been lying around, they've been lying around for like 500, 1,000 years. So if they're 500 years old and they've been lying around for 500 years, now you can go back 1,000 years. So that's how we can go further back in time, not just by using living trees. And I'll show you this slide. So we can look at the patterns in our cores from living trees, but then we can also look at dead trees and go further back in time. We can look at historical buildings and archaeological sites, what I was talking about, go even further back in time that way. And then the peat bogs that I talked about earlier, the subfossil wood, subfossil meaning it's not fossilized yet, but it's in the process of being fossilized. So these are trees that fell into lakes or into peat bogs or into river sediments thousands and thousands of years ago, and have been preserved ever since. And this is some of the oldest wood that we're able to date continuously to the present. And so the longest continuous tree ring chronology that we have for now is the German oak and pine chronology. So it's based on a combination of all of these from Germany, and it's 12,650 years long. So this means we have a ring, we have 12,650 years. Rings. So we have one ring for each of the years in this, over this time period, which is, I find, very impressive. So I'll leave it at that. I want to thank you very much for joining me here. This is Jonas now, the 12-year-old, getting some practice in coring a tree. And I'll stop my share here, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions you might have.
Yeah, I'm back, and I'm going to try to unmute everyone if I can. I'm going to ask you all to unmute. I think you have to go in and unmute now that I've given you permission. So let me see if anyone has a question for Dr. Trouet.
What about fossilized wood? Very good question. So thank you, Doug, for that question. So we're probably talking about petrified wood, or that's you know, the best example that I know of. That is, I think, well, that typically is millions and millions and millions of years old rather than 10,000 years old. So we're not able to link that to the present. We're not able to, you know, our chronology as of now goes back 12,000 years. I don't think we're ever going to make it to, you know, 20 million, 100 million years continuously. But there's actually some really interesting research. You can, a lot of this, if I don't know if anyone, you can look at petrified wood. A lot of these species, you can see the rings in them. And I think it's such a fascinating field of research. Actually, I found out a few things about it by writing this book, and now I'm really fascinated to go in that region, in that direction. So for instance, they found petrified wood on Antarctica. So Antarctica, what now is nothing but an ice field, was forested, you know, 200 million years ago. And it's a bit mind-blowing because through plate tectonics, that continent is no longer there. The tree species that were there 200 million years ago are no longer there, but you can still see the tree rings in that petrified wood. So it's fascinating, and it tells us a little bit about, you know, even though the configuration of the Earth towards the sun has changed over that time, there must have been seasons that long ago, because otherwise there wouldn't be any tree ring. So it can give us some information about these things, but there's a lot of research still to be done in that field.
Other questions, just speak up. Those of you who are unmuted, you can just speak up and ask.
I have a comment. I find the book to be fascinating. I've gotten through maybe half of it so far. And one of the comments you made in there, I found quite interesting, because I find the research to be very objective rather than subjective in terms of looking at trees. And you made the comment that you were not a tree hugger, although I would call myself a tree hugger, but not in the sense that I feel that it's a sentient being. But it is important, as you said, in reading your book, I'm finding out a lot more about, you know, what the trees can tell us. But they are very important to us. Without the trees, we might probably not be here anyway. So they have very much to offer us. And in some respects, I say this with a little bit of little tongue in cheek. Some of the trees, I think, are more important than some humans in terms of what they offer and what they're able to give us. So I find it interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I'm not a tree hugger, and that's true. But you know, you have to be in awe of this species, right? If you think of, for instance, the bristlecone pines, they grow on the border between Nevada and California in the White Mountains. These trees, the oldest living tree is more than 5,000 years old. Like this, what all this tree has witnessed. I mean, it's, as I mentioned, you have to be in awe. I really see them as witnesses to not just what we've done in the past, but also to what we're doing to our Earth system as we speak now, and also, you know, moving forwards towards the future. So I think the concept of trees as witnesses to our human behavior in the past, the present, and the future, to me, is very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of questions, if I may.
Of course.
And these are technical questions. The first one is, are the rings consistent all the way around the tree trunk, or does the orientation make a difference, like south versus north, or maybe the growth of a tree next to it blocking light?
Super important, very good question, and I could talk about that. You know, I teach a class in Introduction to Dendrochronology, and this is basically, you know, I can teach a whole class about this question. Couple of things, yes. So when we select our trees that we sample, we look for trees that typically stand alone, so that there's no competition from trees nearby, because that does influence the trees. If a tree leans over, if it's standing on a slope, for instance, and it's leaning, you get reaction wood, so you want to take samples at a certain angle where that reaction wood is least strong. A big issue of the process of cross dating is that when trees grow very slowly, sometimes there's sections of the circumference where they don't grow rings, so they have missing rings because they're saving their energy, so they're not going to grow a ring everywhere. Or there's even some years where they might, you know what, this year I just don't have the energy to grow a ring, I'm not going to grow a ring. That's why we to deal with all of these factors that influence a tree ring width every year. We typically take a lot of samples from a lot of trees, and that's how you cancel out those individual differences in competition from neighboring trees and leaning over and so forth. And it hasn't happened yet where there's a year that is so bad that no tree forms a ring in that year. You know, by taking samples from a lot of trees allows us to do the process of cross dating and to get to the cleanest, you know, average ring width for a certain year.
Thank you. And another question right now. What about trees in the tropics where there isn't a winter? And would that be continuous growth, or would they have some natural life cycle?
Very good question. I think someone else asked that in the chat as well. It is so. The what I explained here and all the examples I showed here are indeed from temperate forests, where there's very clear seasonality in the climate. It gets a lot more complicated in the tropics. It is possible in the tropics, but it depends on a lot of things, on the tree species. So the wood anatomy of trees in the tropics is often much more complex. Not all trees show rings, even if they have a seasonality in the rings. But what in many areas in the tropics, it's not so much the change in temperature throughout the year, but a change in how much water they get throughout the year. And so they go through periods where, you know, a rainy season and a dry season, and when the dry season is dry enough, they will stop growing in the dry season. But as I mentioned, it's much more complex in the tropics to do dendrochronology. That's also why most of the tree ring research is being done in non-tropical, in temperate and boreal regions. But we're actually writing, as we speak, a synthesis paper about, you know, what all has been done in the tropics and what we have learned from that. So it's a very active field of research. And as technology is advancing as well, I was talking about the CT scans, but there's also chemical analysis that are possible now that weren't possible in the past. It allows us to also analyze expand our options for research in the tropics as well.
Oh, thank you. Your talk was fascinating and very, very interesting subject. And I can see how all the sciences together contribute knowledge. I'm currently engaged in a project I put off for a number of years, which is I've started reading the first volume of Will Durant's The Story of Civilization.
Oh, wow.
Thinking, how does he know all this stuff? So now I'm understanding that you and yours contribute to that. And so maybe that's why we know so much more about European temperate civilization than we do about the tropics, or I don't know, the Arctic or the Antarctic.
Yeah.
So very, very interesting.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I have a quick question, Valerie. That you mentioned that you generally take samples from trees that stand alone, so as not to be influenced by other trees around. Has anybody done any research in comparison to the difference between a tree that stands alone and, you know, for example, a pine, and maybe one that stands with a community, and how that influences the tree?
Yeah, and it depends on the goal of our research study as well, right? If you're an ecologist and you're interested in dynamics between trees, then you're gonna, you know, sample in a dense site. But yeah, there's definitely been research about that, and it can get a little technical now. But if you think of the aspects that influence a tree, the width of a tree ring most, it's the age of the tree, the competition from neighboring trees, the climate of the year, and then if there might be things like a fire or an insect outbreak or anything. And so if you're interested in the climate of the year, you kind of want to minimize those other factors, right? You kind of want to minimize the competition. That's why you sample lone standing trees. You want to minimize impacts of fires or insect outbreaks. So you kind of want to see, if you see a tree with a big fire scar, like I showed, you're not going to sample that one for climate reconstruction, because you know it's been influenced by other things. So whether you sample trees, lone standing trees, or trees in a dense forest, it really depends on what you're trying, the research question that you're trying to answer.
What about carbon dioxide? We're mostly talking seasonal water changes, but I've seen a lot of that in climate change. How does that factor?
Good question. So I haven't talked about this. These are great questions, by the way. I wanted to keep it kind of general, but I'm glad that I'm getting these follow-up questions. So very generally speaking, trees can be, it really depends on what climate factor is most limiting to a tree. So for instance, where I live here in Tucson, it's in Florida as well, it's warm enough throughout the year. So the trees are not really going to be limited by how warm or cold it gets, but they are limited by how much water they have here in Tucson, obviously, in a certain year. So narrow rings form in dry years and wide rings form in wet years. If you go to Canada, Alaska, Siberia, or high elevation to the European Alps, the story changes. There the trees get plenty of water year round, so they don't care whether it's a dry year or not. What they care about is how cold or warm it is, because it's not always warm enough in summer for them to grow a lot. So there the trees are not limited by how much water they get, but by temperature. So if we want to, as climate scientists, if we want to reconstruct drought in the past, like we did with the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada, we go to areas where the trees are limited by drought, we go to dry regions. If we want to reconstruct global warming and how hot or cold it's been in the past, we don't go to Tucson, we go to the European Alps or to Scandinavia, where the trees are sensitive to temperature. Now, again, also there are other aspects of the trees that you can look at apart from the width. You can look at the density of the wood, you can look at the chemistry of the wood, and some of these other metrics are more sensitive to temperature than the ring width alone, but then it's getting a bit technical again there. But so we use different trees for different applications. But that's a great question. I'm glad I was able to explain that.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Just great lecture, great presentation, and always something interesting to learn.
Boy, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I also see that our Ernest has a beautiful wood panel behind him. That's exciting to see.
Would you like to come take a sample?
I'd love to come take a sample. Yeah, next time I'm in Sarasota.
I'm right here in Sarasota down.
All right.
I have a quick question, sort of a personal thing. My son just landed a position at the University of Arizona.
Oh, really? Oh, congratulations.
And if I'm out there to visit him and you're at your lab, could we stop in and be interested to see what the lab looks like?
Yeah, post-pandemic, please do. So I'm a professor in the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. So it is a department of its own. I think we're about 12 faculty who all, do tree ring research as our main field of research. And so we have a very, not now during the pandemic, but we have a very active outreach program as well. We have docents, we have volunteers who go show people through, we have a beautiful new building, we have exhibits, we have an archive, so you can visit all of that definitely once this pandemic
is that building that looks like trees on the outside?
Yeah, exactly.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a great place to be at. Really.
Definitely post-pandemic.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you. If there are no other questions.
One more question. I'm sorry. Every comment leads to another question. What about viral particles in the air? Does that affect trees?
It doesn't, but I do want to show you. Can I share another slide? I don't know if I still have it. Okay.
Of course.
It's one of my favorite. I mean, it's one of these things where even I go like, really? We can see this with tree rings? All right. I didn't show it here because it's a little, sorry, a little complex to explain, but I think this crowd can take it. So this is a study that we did using archaeological wood in Europe, in Central Europe. Over the past 2,500 years. So this is 2,500 years ago, and this is the present on the right. And what you see here is the number of samples that we found of archaeological wood in each century. So we dated about 7,000 samples. A lot of this is from, what's it called? Water wells. Sorry, thank you. Water wells from Roman times. And then here we go into the cathedrals and the historical buildings and so forth. And the recent time is living trees. But so this doesn't show the ring width or anything. It just shows how many samples per decade that we had of historical material, right? And so it kind of shows, I mean, it is a little bit subjective. I mean, not subjective, but there are fluctuations that are just a function of, you know, there's more historical material than there is material from the Roman times. But despite this, you can see these fluctuations in, for instance, here, this is the end of the Roman period. And there just was very little building material. It was a period of complete turmoil. People were not building, the Romans were done building, so we don't find a lot wood, construction wood from this period at all. That picks up as Europe reorganizes itself. There's a dip here that we think is because they were recycling a lot of older wood. But this is the dip I want to, and this is where it gets to your question, the dip I want to draw your attention to. This is the Black Death in Europe. This is when 60% of the European population was wiped out in 10 years' time because of a plague. And you can see that in the dip. This is one of the lowest points, you know, periods of the medieval times, is the decade when there was the Black Death. So to answer your question, you can't really see viral infections in trees directly, but you can see its impact on human society and building activity. So I think this is, when we found this, is like, man, this is too cool. Can't. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for that question.
And thank you everybody. Thank you, Dr. Trouet. It's been terrific. And
You're very welcome.
hope to see you in Sarasota soon, post-pandemic, as you say, although the store is open, but you have to come in a mask so we won't recognize you.
I'll let you know.
Thank you
very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.